The wind outside howled like a warning, but no one in the small, dust-frosted town of Cresswell could have predicted the storm that was about to hit its quietest schoolhouse. Inside, Miss Elira James stood in front of her class, chalk in hand, her voice steady, her heart full. She had been the orphaned teacher for 5 years now, raised by nuns, taught in silence, and loved only by her students. Elira had built her life around the worn wooden desks and curious eyes of her classroom, each lesson a prayer, each child a hope. But on that cold Thursday morning, as the sun filtered through cracked glass, a knock on the door shattered everything she thought she knew. Sheriff Morgan stepped in, tall, iron-faced, with 2 deputies behind him. The room went still. Elira's eyes met his, but there was no warmth in his gaze. Only duty, and something darker. Without saying a word, he handed her a folded paper. Her hand trembled as she opened it. Accusation, theft, embezzlement from the school fund, misuse of donations. Every word burned into her memory. The children watched in stunned silence as the sheriff led their teacher out. The bell hadn't even rung yet, but class was over for Elira. By sunset, the whole town knew. Whispers traveled like fire through dry grass. The orphan girl who became the teacher had now become a criminal in their eyes. They said she used her charm to steal. They said she hid money in her barn. They said she smiled too much for someone with so little. They forgot the nights she stayed after class to clean the floors, the meals she skipped to feed hungry students, the books she bought from her own pocket. Suspicion had a way of replacing truth in Cresswell. At the sheriff's office, Elira sat alone in the holding room, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't touched a penny of that money. The ledger they showed her was doctored. The signatures weren't hers, but how could she prove it? Her voice, soft and unsure, meant little against typed pages and official stamps. No lawyer would take her case for free, and no one would donate now. The same townspeople who had praised her for being a saint with chalk were now saying, "We always wondered about her." The school board met behind closed doors the next day. A temporary replacement was hired. Elira's nameplate was quietly removed. Her students were told not to speak of her. Parents warned their children to stay away from that woman's house. It was as if she had vanished. But in that silence, something unseen had begun to stir. In the attic of the schoolhouse, hidden behind a stack of forgotten science kits, a dusty audio recorder sat buried in a cracked shoebox. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was just a leftover from a teacher's experiment on sound and memory. But what it had captured, just 2 weeks before Elira was accused, might be the only truth left in a town that had lost its heart. And someone had found it. Long before Cresswell turned its back on her, Elira James had a habit of staying late after school, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. It was her way of keeping the silence from creeping in too deep. The silence that used to fill the orphanage halls, where no one tucked her in or whispered good night. In her classroom, that silence had purpose. It was where she graded essays, watered the plants by the window, and locked away memories with every flick of her pen. But what she never realized was that someone else had stayed late too. Someone who saw everything. 10-year-old Charlie Bell was the type of child teachers prayed for. Curious, quiet, always watching. He didn't have many friends, but he had a deep admiration for Miss Elira. She had once given him a pair of socks from her own drawer when he showed up barefoot. He never forgot that. So, 2 weeks before the scandal broke, when Charlie sneaked up to the attic for his class project, a report on sound waves, he borrowed the school's old audio recorder without permission. He left it recording by accident, and when he retrieved it days later, he was too nervous to tell anyone. It had recorded voices, but they weren't his. After the accusations spread, Charlie sat in his bedroom for hours, rewinding the tape again and again. A woman's voice, shrill and hurried, the principal's voice, coaxing and cautious. They were talking about the school funds, about framing, about making the board believe it was her. Then silence, laughter, and a door slamming shut. The recorder had picked up a conversation meant to be forgotten. Charlie's hands trembled, his heart pounded. He was just a child, but he knew this was big, bigger than anyone would believe. Meanwhile, across town, Ilara sat alone in her home. The shutters were closed. The mailbox had been stuffed with torn letters, some hateful, some confused. She hadn't opened them. She had no family to call, no lawyer to trust, no voice to speak louder than the sheriff's. Only her own journal kept her from unraveling. She wrote every night, not to remember, but to survive. And in those pages, she still held hope that truth had eyes somewhere. Charlie told no one at first. He feared the consequences. His father worked in the mayor's office. His mother had warned him not to speak about that teacher. But the weight of injustice grew heavier each time he walked past the empty classroom where Ilara used to sing softly while wiping the board. He knew he couldn't keep it hidden much longer, especially not after he saw what happened next. The principal, a man named Halmer Briggs, was suddenly promoted, offered a new job in the city, with triple the salary. It was too fast, too convenient. And Charlie overheard him whisper on the phone, "She won't fight it. She has nothing." That night, Charlie went back into the attic. He placed the recorder into a shoebox. On top of it, he wrote a single note. This proves she didn't do it. But even courage needs a spark. 3 days later, as the school held its annual Clean Slate event, where families gathered to celebrate their history and forget their missteps, Charlie walked up to the makeshift stage. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he wasn't alone. His best friend Maya, braver, older, stood beside him, holding the shoebox like it held treasure. The microphone crackled as she spoke. The crowd grew quiet. And then the audio played. The voices echoed across the courtyard like ghosts returning to demand justice. Gasps, whispers, people frozen in disbelief, parents covering children's ears too late. The principal's face drained of color. The sheriff turned pale. Ilara, who had stayed hidden in her home all week, heard the commotion from blocks away. The truth was no longer silent. It wasn't just a moment. It was a spark that lit the bones of Cresswell on fire. The recording played by Maya and Charlie spread faster than the rumors that once crushed Miss Ilara's name. That evening, someone posted the audio clip online. By midnight, every parent in town had heard it. By morning, local reporters stood outside the school gates. Principal Halmer Briggs didn't show up for work. And for the first time in weeks, the sheriff's office didn't turn away visitors. They were swarmed by them. But Ilara? She hadn't stepped outside yet. She couldn't. Years of surviving as an orphan had taught her to distrust good news. She stared at her cracked ceiling that morning, unsure if the world outside had changed or if it was just another storm pretending to pass. That was when Sister Beatrice, her old guardian from the orphanage, knocked on her door with tearful eyes and trembling hands. She had heard the tape. She brought flowers and soup, but more than that, she brought belief, and belief had been missing for far too long. The mayor called for an emergency town hall that night. The auditorium overflowed with townspeople who now looked guilty, ashamed, or unsure how they ever believed Ilara capable of such a crime. Charlie and Maya sat in the front row, their heads high. When Ilara finally walked in, wearing the same modest blue dress she had been arrested in, every eye turned. She did not speak. She didn't have to. The silence, once a curse, now wrapped around her like armor. The meeting was fierce. Halmer Briggs had fled the county, leaving behind a resignation letter and no trace of the stolen money. But the audio remained undeniable. It proved collusion, it showed betrayal, and it exposed a system that had used Ilara as a scapegoat to cover its own greed. Sheriff Morgan spoke next. He tried to apologize, but his words were heavy and hollow. "We believed what we were told," he said. But the room knew better. They had wanted to believe it, because lies are easier to carry than guilt. A reinvestigation was ordered. Ilara's name was formally cleared. But apologies didn't erase the pain. Her home had been vandalized, her bank account frozen, her reputation shattered, and still she stood. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had weathered fire and walked through it, still holding the hands of the children she had taught with love. Days passed. Donations poured in, news cameras left, but scars lingered. Ilara received offers to teach in bigger towns, to start a foundation, to write a book. She said no. She had only one request: to reopen her classroom. The same classroom where she was taken away in cuffs. She wanted to return, not for justice, but for closure, for healing, for the children. And so, on a quiet Monday morning, the school bell rang again. Ilara James walked back into room 3B. Her chalkboard was clean, her desk had fresh flowers, and her students sat with hands folded, eyes shining. Not because she had been proven right, but because she had never stopped being theirs. Then, in the last row, she noticed a letter placed gently on her table. No name, just 5 words. "I never stopped believing you." She smiled, for the first time in weeks. There was a stillness in Cresswell that hadn't been felt in years. It wasn't the stillness of silence, but of reverence, of people walking a little slower when they passed the schoolhouse, of parents holding their children closer, of teachers rewriting their lesson plans with more care than ever. Because one woman's fall and rise had exposed more than corruption. It had cracked open the town's conscience, and from that crack, something new was beginning to grow. Ilara James never asked for revenge. She didn't press charges against the sheriff or the board. She didn't go on television or sell her story. She simply returned to her classroom and taught like nothing had changed, though everything had. Her students were more attentive, her colleagues more respectful. But there was one thing she couldn't shake: the quiet pain of betrayal. Not from strangers, but from the very people who had once hugged her after parent-teacher meetings and dropped pies at her door during holidays. The school board extended an official apology, but it came through a typed letter, signed at the bottom, with none of the human touch she had once given to every single child's homework. The mayor, too, sent flowers. They withered on her windowsill. It wasn't malice she felt. It was emptiness. Because when the world turns its back on you once, you never forget the shape of that shadow. One evening, as the town hosted a festival to honor community educators, Ilara was named guest of honor. She didn't want to attend, but Maya and Charlie insisted. "It's for the kids," Maya whispered. Ilara wore the same soft yellow dress she'd worn the day she first signed her teaching contract. She walked through the crowd not like a celebrity, but like a survivor. People clapped, but some couldn't meet her eyes. Others tried to hug her. She offered them a polite smile, and that was enough. Then, something unexpected happened. On the stage, Charlie stepped up to the mic once again. But this time, he wasn't holding a recorder. He held a handmade journal, bound with blue ribbon and gold-inked letters. The class of room 3B, our teacher, our hero. Each child had written something: a memory, a drawing, a thank you. Some were messy, others poetic, but every page carried love and truth. Charlie handed it to her in front of the whole town. "This is how we remember you," he said. "Not because you were accused, but because you were never afraid to keep teaching, even when the world was unfair." Ilara's hands trembled as she accepted the book. Not from fear, but from release. In that moment, something melted inside her. The ice of injustice, the weight of false guilt. She realized something powerful. She hadn't just been fighting to clear her name. She had been fighting for every silent teacher, every falsely accused soul, every orphan child who dared to rise. That night, she sat by candlelight and read every single page of the journal. She didn't sleep. She didn't need to. By dawn, the birds sang a little louder. The air felt a little kinder, and for the first time, she opened her windows. It was a clear morning when the town of Cresswell finally decided to rewrite its story. Not with speeches nor plaques, but with action. Miss Elara James arrived early that day, as always, her satchel worn but dependable, her steps steady though the ground she once walked on had betrayed her. She no longer feared eyes watching her, because now they watched with respect, not suspicion. The school gate creaked open behind her as she walked in, her fingers grazing the stone wall near the garden where a surprise had been waiting. There, newly built and freshly painted, stood a stone bench engraved with a single line. For those who teach, even when the world turns away. Below it, her name. No titles, no apology. Just her name, carved where children could sit and remember the woman who stayed when she could have left. Inside room 3B, the world felt whole again. The walls were brighter, the desks cleaner. A sense of peace filled the space, as if the room itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. But something even more remarkable happened that morning. As Elara stepped to the board to begin her lesson, a young boy, new to town, quiet, withdrawn, stood up and handed her a letter. He was one of many displaced students from the nearby valley where budget cuts had closed down schools. She opened the folded paper. It read, "I heard you help kids who don't have anyone. I don't have anyone either. Can I stay here?" She looked at the child and, without a word, nodded. That was how healing began. Not with grand gestures, but small permissions to be seen, to be heard, to belong. That boy would later go on to become the town's youngest ever teacher. He would say, in his own words, that a woman with nothing gave him everything. News of Elara's redemption reached further than the town's borders. A foundation was formed in her name, offering legal help to falsely accused educators across the country. Letters from teachers who had suffered in silence came flooding in, some from prisons, some from hospital beds, some from halfway houses. All of them began their letters with the same line, "I thought I was alone, until I heard about you." Elara never sought fame, but her quiet perseverance, her refusal to grow bitter, and the courage of 2 children with a dusty recorder became a national lesson. She taught America what courage looked like in chalk and linen. And more than that, she reminded people that injustice doesn't end with exposure. It ends when the wounded choose to keep walking anyway. Years later, the town of Cresswell would rename the school after her. They invited her to speak. She was older now, her hair grayer, her steps slower. But her voice, still soft, carried further than any microphone could. She stepped onto the stage, eyes glimmering with tears, and said only this, "If a child hadn't spoken, I wouldn't be standing here. So listen to your children. They know the truth we forget." And in the front row, now grown, Charlie and Maya stood with pride, each holding their own journals. The orphaned teacher had not only reclaimed her name, she had written a new one into the soul of the town.